This is Mae Brussell. It's tape number 669, October the 1st, 1984. There is something weird happening around here, and I want to share it with you because many of you have taken these tapes for a long time, and I thought you'd be interested in knowing what's happening. If I know myself, I'll describe it to you. These tapes for many years, in fact, from the time that I began putting them on cassettes, and I just want to explain what was taking place here in case it happens again. I can update you and we can figure out what's going on. I'm not really, I have a pretty good idea, but I want to share it with you. I went off the air temporarily since August the 6th. My son got 3 messages on his answering machine. One was a weird message talking about pizzas. Hey, why don't you pick them up? And they mentioned his name, and it was a conversation that didn't make sense, but the background, there was some birds tweeting. The second message he got was a threat. He was going to be killed. They said, this woman said, we're following you night and day. We know where you are. But the same background as the first message, and then there was a third one of ho-hum and noises. Again, the same background, but not talking. And I went off the air, but kept the time slot open. I go to the station once a week and put on records on the Kennedy assassination, on Robert Kennedy, on the alleged moon landing, the record of the astronauts up there, and have a few comments, but not the kind of thing we have every week on these broadcasts or on the tapes. And last week I was in Los Angeles for a few days, and I came home Sunday night and went to the station at Kazoo from 8 to 9, and when I got home there was a message on my answering machine, on my machine, saying, well, welcome home, you've been away. Glad you're back. And it was the same voice that had been to my son's home, only he changed his number right away. And so obviously this parties knew that that was my son and this was my home, because now I was getting the message after these weeks passed. And then this party said, we'll have to have some lunch, some lettuce and some pancakes, and go over the script. Okay. It was a very distinguishable voice. I put them side by side on a tape to listen to. It sounded like the same person. And that was Monday night. Well, yesterday, Sunday night, I was listening to 60 Minutes, and just the last segment when Andy Rooney was on, I heard voices on the television set. I have 2 sets, one in the bedroom I was sitting. They were listening to it, and I heard voices, and I looked up, and it was a radio coming through, shortwave radio, 2 people talking to each other, and I didn't really pick up the message, but it wasn't on the program, and I figured that's what they were doing, and figured it got tangled with the TV wires, or whatever. I don't know much about radio work, but you could hear it on the television, the communication between this party and another, and several times, and after I knew it wasn't background of the TV, I just figured, as I say, the wires were twisted. And then the same voice, the party who had talked to his home and to me last week, says, well, how are you tonight? How are you? And it was the same voice, only this time it was coming from my television set to me, not to the other person. It wasn't the technical work, where we're contacting and that kind of stuff. And it was exactly the Big Brother of 1984. The only thing I could remember or think of at the time of Watergate, and I have the papers here, I can look them up, there were plans definitely made of the Office Emergency Service to put 2-way communication into everybody's home. It would cost each of us $5, so that if there were earthquakes, they would tell you, go to the nearest block or go to this church or this school, or if there were floods and for national disasters or so forth, they would tell you where to go through your television set. And the reason it was stopped was that the television set, with this kind of a device, could pick up conversation in the house, just like the telephones now, the cordless telephones. You can talk to other people, but other people can pick up your conversation. So this was stopped at the time of the Watergate exposés and the worrying about Big Brother and Operation Chaos and the COINTEL program and everything. So the technology is there, just like the transponders were made. The 25 million transponders were made about 20 years ago to put inside of people's bodies surgically, and then you could control them what they think and what they do in the areas they travel by computer, these transponders. So I just wanted to tell you that this voice, I wasn't hearing anything. I wasn't drinking, honestly, and it really did freak me out. But I did want to share it with you. It's worth telling you because I don't know if it'll happen again. I'm not going to sit at the TV all day waiting for somebody to talk to me. And sometimes I'll turn it on and sometimes I won't. Maybe I'll just pull it out so that they don't hear through that instrument in the house. But the one party that called me knew I'd been away, and the other one was doing this, so it's possible when you're out of town to get into the house and fix that kind of thing, too. Well, so much for that. We'll go on to what we want to share this evening, but I did want to pass this on because I was freaked out, and I'm okay, but I thought you should know about it. This time last year, on October 3rd, this is 1983, broadcast number 617, I was talking about Daniel Graham, Lieutenant Daniel Graham from High Frontier, the former chief of the Defense Intelligence Agency, who started a political action committee with Robert Dornan as the president. Dornan is very close to Jerry Falwell and the far right, the Christian right. Robert Dornan works with Daniel Graham, and they were offering $1 million to the candidates for 1984 that would push for the Star War weapons. And I was saying how outrageous that this man wants to push these weapons. Of course, making those is the firm of Helionetics, making a part of them an Edward Teller, with his links to Western Goals and Los Angeles Police Department. The cast of characters running through the script is narrowing itself down to the same people acting over and over again in consort with each other. Mr. Dornan is on the Coalition for Peace Through Strength that I'll talk more about in a few moments, with Jerry Falwell as co-chairman. There's a cozy relationship between Daniel Graham and the late Larry McDonald and John Reese of Western Goals. And, of course, Graham shares offices in Washington, D.C., the Institute on Strategic Trade, with General Fritz Kramer. I call him General Fritz Kramer. I don't think he was an American general. I like to think he's Hitler's general, or I think he was or could be the mentor behind Henry Kissinger. Last year also I talked about the murder of Alan David Saxon, involved with a massive gold company, gold swindle, money that left Canada and came to Beverly Hills and L.A. and then went down to Brazil and Swiss banks, possibly some more Nazi tanglement of money. And he used the California Commercial Bank set up by Johnny Carson and his attorney Henry Bushkin, and that bank closed after the scandals began coming in, but Alan David Saxon was linked to that bank, and they had money with mafia down in the Cayman Islands and elsewhere, Canada, and with DeLorean Motor. Also, Larry McDonald was in the Cayman Islands just before the fatal Korean airline crash went down, and I mentioned that. And then on that broadcast, I went into links of Marvin Mitchelson, who had been Vicki Morgan's attorney. She had just been murdered the week before, and Roy Cohn and General Graham and John Reese and Mr. and Mrs. William Casey of the CIA, their close association of all of these people with various parties that were going on in Washington. Bloomingdale was dead. Vicki Morgan was dead. Mitchelson, Roy Cohn, and people from Western Goals seemed to be having a big time celebrating in John Reese, even though Larry McDonald had only been dead a very short time. September the 1st, this is 3 weeks later, that they're all partying in Capitol Hill, the members of Birch Society, the CIA, and the interconnecting links of the military through Daniel Graham and the High Frontier. That broadcast was sent by Larry Flint to every member of Congress. He spent almost $5,000, almost $6,000, to send that at the time to every member, which was pretty great of him. I still think that was the beginning of his real problems. He doesn't see it that way, so maybe I'm better off. He doesn't blame me, but I feel like I have some responsibility. Now, last week I mentioned the death of Dr. Rita Sognnaes, Sognnaes. That's the forensic dentist who positively identified the teeth of Adolf Hitler and positively identified the teeth of Martin Bormann, who was brought to UCLA in 1960 to start the Department of Forensic Dentistry, which is to identify the teeth of the dead. What I didn't tell you, and it wasn't part of all the obituaries, but was in a separate article to show you the parts left out. There was a report in November of 1981 about this same doctor, and the fact that he said that Eva Braun possibly left the bunker, that he said she didn't die with Hitler. One article I have here is from the LA Times, another one from the San Francisco Examiner. November the 8th, 1981, new dental records uncovered by a California research team strongly suggest that the woman next to Adolf Hitler in the bunker was not his mistress, Eva Braun. The findings indicate that Braun had to be buried elsewhere or else escaped. She was with Hitler since 1936. She spent 9 years as his mistress, and when the Soviet soldiers found the bodies, they thought that the woman with Hitler was Braun, but it wasn't. The dental record, the odontological data, virtually eliminates the previous assumption that the woman's body was the remains of Eva Braun. It presented evidence of a dental bridge made for Braun to identify the corpse. Actually, that bridge had never at any time been installed in her mouth. Teeth were found with the body that showed extensive cavities. Eva Braun had no cavities at all. There were 2 cosmetic crowns that were in her mouth of fireproof porcelain. They were never found on that other body. The medical journal says that the woman found in the grave had extensive shrapnel and wounds, and that Eva Braun, if she died, would have taken poison, because Martin Bormann, this is the great expert, said that she was slumped in a sofa, that Hitler had a pistol at his side, and beside him laid Eva with a cyanide capsule. The medical journal based their findings upon a team led by Ryder Sognnaes, a professor at the University of California, and he said the Russian identification of Braun would never stand up in court. There were a number of men in the bunker, unaccounted for, who could have helped her. No one actually witnessed her death, and there are inconsistencies in the account of those who took the body outside the bunker. Hitler's final hours were documented by his aides. Now, Hitler's aides documented, according to history, that Hitler shot himself and that she took cyanide. But in the bunker, the last days were only his most trusted aides. Why would they necessarily be telling the truth? If they lied about Eva Braun, they could lie about Adolf Hitler. And then this article goes on, a short time later, the Fuhrer's deputy heard a shot. He was there supposedly up to the end to give the accounting of it. The great Martin Bormann, the escape artist himself, who runs a financial empire from South America and Switzerland and elsewhere. The Fuhrer's deputy said that Hitler had died by the pistol and Eva had taken cyanide. Now that is Martin Bormann's story, and then Martin Bormann was supposed to have been dead, identified by Dr. Sognnaes. Now he says that no, Eva was alive. Bormann and Hitler were dead, and history has proved over and over again that Bormann is alive. So you ask the question, if he's wrong about Eva, if they're wrong about Eva Braun, and he says she probably left alive, and if they're wrong about Bormann, son, and he really is alive when the dentist said he was dead. History showed, that I mentioned last week, about Mr. Mueller and the SS official, Heinrich Mueller. They were wrong about his death. They said he was officially dead when he was seen alive in South America and the tombstone was opened up. So, and Himmler, there are questions about his death. Did he come to New York, or did he really die? Then why would Adolf have to die? You all know what I think about those. Those of you taking the broadcast know my opinion. I don't think he did die. And because these reports came of the death of the dentist who verified Bormann and Hitler, I thought I would share you with this evening the fact that he does admit that Eva Braun escaped and that Bormann was there when both of them, when obviously Eva had to escape because Bormann would be lying to say she took cyanide and there was no physical evidence. So you don't have to untangle that whole thing to this nth degree like I have. I summarized it for you. I think they all lived. That's what I think. They got away. The top ones all got away. Now I'm going with part 2, back to the fundamentalist Christians. I could do 5 consecutive weeks on that, so I'm going to cut out all news and get as much in as I can to finish that one article that I shared with you last week, complete that, and then go on some more to Falwell and the Christians. But before I get to part two, and not separate from it, I just want to share with you an article of Jack Anderson that was in the Monterey Herald yesterday, for the reason that the people he's talking about in this article are the same people that are working with the fundamentalist Christians and the Vatican at this time. And I want you to know the character of these religious people, such as Mr. Bill Casey of the CIA and Paul LAXALT, close friends of Jerry Falwell. I want you to know what they're doing at the present time. This is called The CIA and the Extremists. And Jack Anderson says, I warned you a few years ago, August 26, 1981, that the CIA was preparing to join forces with totalitarian regimes and anti-communist factions in the conduct of covert operations around the world. Of course, he knows long before 81 this has been going on. He's written about Operation Condor, Project Paperclip, Colonial Dignitad. But in 1981, he warned you some more. He said, I told you it can open up a Pandora's box of CIA-sponsored coups and revolutions. It would throw us into the uncomfortable embrace with extremists who are morally objectionable, dictators who oppose U.S. principles, terrorists whom we claim to abhor. I point the finger at CIA Chief William Casey, who I wrote was eager to stir up mischief for unfriendly regimes and wasn't too particular about whom the CIA finds to do their dirty work. Thereafter, the CIA unleashed the Contra forces in a secret regime in Nicaragua. It is difficult, if not impossible, for the CIA to control what the surrogates are doing. My associate, John Anderson, he says, traveled for 2 years in and out of Central and South America, covered atrocities of the communists and so forth, but this is what he's concerned with. He's concerned with some incidents that could blacken the CIA's efforts. Here are some examples. Ray Hooker, a respected Nicaraguan editor and candidate for the National Assembly in the forthcoming election, was kidnapped on September the 5th, just less than a month ago, by CIA-backed Contras. He was last seen waving off. Would-be rescuers were coming, apparently afraid his captors would kill him on the spot. He hasn't been heard of since. 2. Last summer, a well-known Contra commander, a former Somoza National Guard officer, who called himself Mr. Suicide, went on a homicidal rampage after his wife was killed. He attacked a border town. He killed several civilians. He executed dozens of Sandinista prisoners. CIA agents ordered him placed under arrest. The Contra leadership agreed, and according to rumors, the Contras have disposed of their troublesome colleague with a bullet in his head. My associate was told of a Missouri Indian commander. His units would routinely execute prisoners. First, they tortured them to get information with grisly details on how the prisoners of war were finished off. This is what he said. For the killing of prisoners, we use the youngest boys, 14 and 15 years old. They're the best. They're too young to have learned a conscience. And these are all paid by the CIA. A month ago, in one of the Indian camps, the chief of Missouri's military operations told about in a burst of candor, I love killing. I've been killing for the past 7 years. There's nothing I like better. If I could, I'd kill several people a day. The self-confessed psychopath is the former National Guard lieutenant, and he has 2 ways to deal with the Sandinista prisoners. He either burns them alive or he strips the skin off their backs and pours salt in the bleeding flesh. Funded by our CIA, of course. The Contras of the CIA's favorite rebel group, their favorite, have told my associate similar tales of gore. They told matter-of-factly that they captured Sandinista soldiers who showed no inclination to join the anti-government rebels. They were shot, again after being tortured for information. The same treatment was meted out to spies, snitches, collaborators in communities occupied by the Contras. By the Contras' own account, corruption is permitted, participated in by the CIA's control agents on the scene. The CIA uses Puerto Rican or Cuban-American contact agents, such as the anti-Castro Cubans, because they have no loyalty to anyone. Their source is secret, and who can the CIA complain to? The marked exception to brutal treatment was that done by Eden Pastora, who was recently shot and almost killed, who has not tortured, who has tried to communicate with people and reason with them. Pastora was not supported with American aid. The Somoza soldiers are. And you remember the stories of Michael Townley down at Colonial Dignidad, working for the CIA and for Vernon Walter with George Bush as director of the CIA, quartering people alive at Colonial Dignidad, burning people alive, quartering people alive, taking the flesh off the back and pouring salt in. Think about this, because this is your government, your president, and he mentions William Casey and his desire to work with these people. And the reason I mention this right now is that John SINGLAUB, who works closely with Jerry Falwell and is on the Coalition for Peace Through Strength, is the chairman now of the World Anti-Communist League, who has participated with the Nazis, the Nazi tortures, and has brought in various groups of people that have gone to Germany for training and worked with the Gestapo themselves to perfect these torturous things that are going on in South and Central America. Now, last week I was sharing this information I had with you on Jerry Falwell, Reagan's Prophet of Armageddon. And I said that on July the 7th, 1984, 300 Christians, led by Falwell, went to the White House to tell Ronald Reagan what they wanted from him if they were going to support him for re-election. And attending the meeting was George Bush, Edwin Meese, and William Clark. And 1 week later, 2 days later than that, this is July the 9th, a letter was sent out by Paul LAXALT to the various Christian ministers, and I'll put this on the air either this week or next week. 2 days after that meeting, just weeks before, 4 or 5 weeks before the convention in Dallas, telling these ministers about the necessity to register in their particular congregations, the fundamentalist evangelical Christians, to vote for Ronald Reagan and George Bush for president. After they went to the White House, 2 days later, the letter goes out. Paul LAXALT has paid $50,000 during this time period to raise money for the GOP. And, of course, he is a close friend with Mr. William Casey of the CIA and Robert Keith Gray, and the links to Henry Kissinger. So this church letter wasn't just coincidental. It was following the visit of those people. And then, on August 23rd, Jerry Falwell was there to lower his eyes and give his prayer for Ronald Reagan and the famous prayer breakfast, and I will go back to that. But this was a well-laid introduction to a very serious situation in this country. Now, I'm just going to review, just in 1 second, the summary of last week to get on to this complicated story of biblical material that may or may not be familiar to, certainly not to all of you, and get to the story of Christian fundamentalism in case you didn't get last week's broadcast, or even if you did, to review with you what this article was about. It's an unpublished article. It was given to me to share with you and will be published by the author someday. This original work is done by one particular person or two. I'm not sure whether there were two involved with this or not, but I'm passing it on to you, and then we'll update it with my own material after I share that with you. The thesis was that Ronald Reagan has nuclear missiles in various countries in Europe. At the same time he's placing these warheads there, he's escalating his politics with Christian fundamentalism, that the Christian fundamentalism has worldwide attention, TV satellites, educational system, preschool through college, newspapers, that it can be used to put down people who don't vote for Ronald Reagan, who are for a nuclear freeze. It gets people to register to vote. They push the present White House occupant, who's given them the green light. They have been promised to select and approve of at least 2 justices of the next Supreme Court, and they equate the anti-war with being anti-biblical and anti-American. And the middleman of all this, with the interconnecting links, is Jerry Falwell, between the fundamentalist Christian churches and the White House, and he also is the liaison of those churches to the Pentagon and the National Security Council, where he gets briefing on nuclear freezes, and set up as co-chairman the Coalition for Peace Through Strength with various members such as SINGLAUB, Admiral Moore, General Lemnitzer, and I'll go through the names of some of those people with you in a second. Falwell believes in Armageddon. That is part of God's plan, this confrontation, this war in the Middle East. Christians have nothing to fear in a nuclear war. Fundamentalists will and should be enjoying rapture. If you're a Christian, God will prevent you from dying when the end time is near. We're approaching a 7-year tribulation period, and this is where your rapture takes place, in this pre-tribulation period. So you should be right there now. Pre-tribulation, just before tribulation. We're going to get pre-tribulation, and the rapture is now. Then tribulation, and then the millennium. There's 3 stages. Before tribulation, true Christians will vanish from the face of the earth. The Lord comes and empties the graves of the saints alive and takes them and the alive. They won't die. And they will go into glorified bodies and be forever with him. That is your rapture. Your tribulation is your Armageddon. That's in the inevitable conflict before the millennium. The unsaved are left behind. They will endure 7 years of horrible tribulation. This is called Jacob's tribulation. The Lord will purge the earth. The earth then will be prepared for the establishment of our Lord's kingdom on earth. And after 7 years of tribulation, if you are saved, you will enjoy. Now, the President of the United States goes along with this. He describes himself as a born-again Christian, and he supports the theology that I'm telling you, whether you believe that or not. The millennium follows tribulation, 1,000 years of utopia. If you follow Jesus, if you experience rapture, you will return to the earth. Falwell believes in a limited nuclear war, and this is why he works with Daniel Graham and the Defense Department and the National Security Agency. The war will happen in the mid-tribulation, in that 7-year period. It's going to be the Soviet Union versus Israel, which is the Armageddon in the Mid-East. He says not all Russians are bad, and there's many Christians in China that are okay. So rapture will save Russians and Chinese, and only the atheists and the non-Christians will be roasted. And the role of Israel in all of this, they'll have a special role, according to the fundamentalists, with the tribulation. Russia will fight Israel, and then Israel will help knock out Russia. They'll have a role in destroying or weakening Russia. They're useful for this. And then after the victory of Israel over Russia, at the end of mid-tribulation, the 7-year test of scorching the earth, the Armageddon comes and Israel has to be destroyed. They can enjoy themselves now, but they got to get ready to leave. And the Antichrist will rise up, and the Roman Empire and fundamentalists are worried about the connection of the British and the European groups together. They want a religious, they have a religious antithesis to elements in Europe and Britain, and the fundamentalist Christians want to see them die as the Antichrist, and there's a preparation for the end of time. John Paul II, of course, from the Vatican, the Auschwitz Pope, is pushing with the Irish Catholics and the IRA versus Britain, and John Paul is close to Arafat and the PLO against Israel, and of course he's with the Eastern Europeans against the Russians. Now that was just last week's, in case you didn't get that or didn't understand that, quick summary, because the next half hour and on we're going to be sharing the concluding part of this particular research, this one paper on the Armageddon, Falwell, and Ronald Reagan. Falwell is ready for the war. The Armageddon is coming, he says, the war with Russia. And he shows this. He has a complicated, not so complicated if you know it, it's called the Gog Magog from out of the book of Ezekiel, Gog-Magog. And he says that's the USSR. Ezekiel 38 tells him that Gog is the prince of Rosh, R-O-S-H. So he figures Rosh is Israel, and he thinks that is the root of Russia. And then Ezekiel's Gomer, G-O-M-E-R, he thinks is the land of Gomer, which happens to be Eastern Europe. So this is the group that's under bondage to communism, the way he interprets the Bible, and that we're going into the period of Gog Magog, exactly taken out of the scriptures, the way Jerry Falwell sees it. I'll take a 1-minute break and then go on to Jerry Falwell's theology, Ronald Reagan's supporting it, helping each other, and then reaching out to the world at large in a much more scary way. Now, Jerry Falwell works very closely with Reverend Walvoord, Walvoord. He's the president of the Dallas Theological Seminary, and he influences Falwell. He is a promoter of rapture, that enjoyment in the pre-tribulation period, and he wrote in the Nations of Prophecy, and in Prophecy. And Falwell quotes Walvoord's book, Nations in Prophecy, when he writes his own book, a small pamphlet called Armageddon, Coming War with Russia. And Falwell talks about his concern of the biblical interpretation of weapons versus the kinds of weapons we have today, which is kind of technical and not important really to what we're saying. But they both agree on this Armageddon and the 7-year tribulation period where the people who don't believe, the non-believers, the not born-againers and so forth, will burn to death and perish in hell. And then comes the Millennium, which is the 1,000 years of peace, and Falwell and Walvoord and others like them say a real Christian will be in heaven getting used to their transformed bodies, while the non-believers on earth are destroyed. Christians will descend with Christ at the time of the Armageddon when that's over, and Falwell has a tape of nuclear war, and it's called Nuclear War, and he says that that's a time of joy, it's a time of holiness, reproduction of living saints, and the saints will have children, beget children, and there'll be labor and prosperity. And then all of a sudden the 1,000-year reign of Christ will come, and people will come back to the earth. It will be cleansed of the burned out souls who are polluting the earth, and then you'll have the temple of the millennium, and it will be glorious, and Jesus will be there and in charge of it. And he speaks of holy genocide. The death of millions is necessary. It's part of God's plan to bring the 1,000-year Christian Reich. Jesse Helms, who's very close and supported by and supports the fundamentalist churches such as this, refuses to sign the genocide treaty. He's been carrying this on for 36 years. Well, his biblical training tells him that holy genocide is coming, so maybe that's why Jesse Helms has been holding out. Falwell says, and the Reverend in Texas says, that this is part of God's plan, that all these people are going to burn and roast to hell, the non-Christians, and the battle will be from a positive viewpoint. And for this he gets Revelations 19, 17-21, where the beast and the kingdom of earth and the armies will make battle against him, and the beasts are taken, and the false prophets, and they're cast alive in the lake of fire, and burning brimstone. And the reason I referred to the Jack Anderson story as of yesterday was the taking the flesh off and putting the salt and burning people alive, because the people who are doing this, who are recruited, many of them are fundamentalist Christians who some Vietnam veterans have been involved in the tortures down there with the CIA, teaching CIA, and many from Nazi Germany. But they refer they're burning alive and don't think anything of it. If the remnant were slain with sword, there's a quotation of his, the sword would, to paraphrase it, would proceed through his mouth, and all the fowls were filled with their teeth. It sounds vague and a little strange, the biblical translation, but it means that you stick the sword through their throat and out the other end of their head, and Falwell adds in huge capital letters, that will be the day. As I say, Jesse Helms won't sign the genocide treaty, and according to Falwell and these fundamentalists, genocide is inevitable. Now, they believe in the Holocaust culture, and according to this paper, this essay on the subject, the Holocaust culture is definitely on the TV and in radios, and Reagan is talking all the time about his limited nuclear war, that he can win it, the winnable nuclear war, and Falwell believes in the nuclear war, the limited nuclear war, and millions are being culturally conditioned to accept nuclear war. This is part of the article, that there are other people besides Falwell promoting the rapture doctrine, this pre-trial period of tribulation, a Christian radio broadcasting, Christian TV, and he cites an author, Hal Lindsey, who wrote The Late Great Planet Earth, who is a graduate of the Dallas Theological Seminary, where Dr. John Walvoord teaches, who influences Falwell, and Lindsey happens to be the best-selling author of the decade. He sold 15 million copies of his book, and the book is about the story of rapture, of mid-tribulation periods, the period before the 7 years with the separation of those who ordained and those who roast in hell. And all fundamentalists share Falwell's basic outline. So if you think this is one lone nut, many of them share them. Now, along with Falwell on the Coalition for Peace Through Strength, I'm not going to take time now to give you the names of all of them, just to run down a few of them. There is Senator John Garn, the conservative from Utah, and Representative Jack Kemp, and Major General, former Chief of U.S. Air Force Keegan, Keegan. These are important people because George Keegan was the former Chief of the U.S. Air Force Intelligence, not just the Air Force, but the intelligence. Senator Paul LAXALT is on that group. Now, LAXALT was selected by the youth organization, I'll do more in a little bit on that, to become the next president of the United States to follow on after Ronald Reagan. He's on that group along with General Lemnitzer, former chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff. These are the people that build up our arms with retired generals and fundamentalist Christian preachers. This is the combination of the belief in the limited nuclear war, in an inevitable war, and combining it with the men of Christ who are pushing this war and are pushing the fundamentalist religion. On Falwell's Coalition for Peace Through Strength, there is General Lemnitzer, former chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff, and Mrs. Phyllis Schlafly, she is the president of Eagle Forum. She's the woman who puts up so much money for Pat Robertson with his Christian broadcasting, and I'll do more on him later, just to give you an idea of who these people are. And she was behind the selections that Ronald Reagan made for that Council on Humanities. I gave you that list of characters, including Mr. LAXALT's brother, and William Simon on the board of directors of the Helionetics with Edward Teller, who's part of making these star weapons and who is a Knight of Malta, knighted by the Vatican. The Vatican and the Christian fundamentalists cross over here. Helen Marie Taylor, that new appointment to the humanities of Ronald Reagan, who is on the board of Western Goals with their computers into police departments. She is one of the people on the board of Coalition for Peace Through Strength with Jerry Falwell as co-chairman. Professor William Van Cleve of the Strategic and Security Studies Program, and General Albert Wiedemeyer, and I've done broadcasts on him, the chief of U.S. strategist in World War II, who studied with Adolf Hitler up until the time that he invaded Poland, studied with the German army, and came home, and then has worked with the Germans back and forth ever since. Now, the question is asked about the author of this material, how many of the new right from the United States intelligence and Pentagon share the philosophical religious opinions of Ronald Reagan and Falwell? There are many people in the intelligence community linked to the Knights of Malta who've taken their oath to the Vatican and protecting the Roman Empire. Alexander Haig, Vernon Walters, James and William Buckley. We've gone down that list, and not all of them, Claire Luce, over and over. But these names reappear. How many of them in the government are there, and to what degree do they believe in this? Now, this article cites three people, such as SINGLAUB and Lemnitzer and George Keegan, working with Jerry Falwell, who are perfect examples of having influence in the strategic weapons and military planning for nuclear war while having the biblical friendships and contacts with Falwell and Reagan. SINGLAUB, the head of the World Anti-Communist League, working with Nazis, death squads, the Waffen-SS, and those torturous people making hell on earth as if we are right now in the tribulation period. General LYMAN LEMNITZER, who's a 33-degree Mason who's involved himself with swearing of secret blood oaths, lying in coffins, and been involved with the Masonic situation of raising the dead. George Keegan, who's a fundamentalist Christian who speaks at right-wing movements and you wouldn't call them rallies, but wherever people congregate to talk about the New Age events, George Keegan's name is known. Now, all three of these men directed American military planning for nuclear war. Keegan is the most respected and known for his CIA work on the B team. George Bush and Keegan worked on the A and B team where they allegedly were writing a script that the Soviet Union was planning a winnable nuclear war. Now, Falwell spreads his Rapture document to high government circles. He plays a key role in disseminating this to millions of people. Ronald Reagan has encouraged this, and the question is asked again, how far will it go? And the article concludes with a quotation of Brian Wilson from a study called Magic and Millennium, where it talks about warriors with supernatural powers, where warfare is the center of focus, where the supernatural is the stimulus, but a subsidiary, that there's always a prophet or a magician who directs this thing but can't stand alone, but needs the warrior to carry out his ideas. It's warfare rather than the millennium that they're concerned about. The prophet is the subsidiary to the warrior. Falwell is the prophet and Reagan is the warrior, and the gospel is the gospel of death. Now that is one story on Falwell, and I think it brings out the scary fact that the Pentagon and the National Security Council and these horrible people are working together. Now, after taking that material, I'll go into other material that I have that goes along with that idea and separate from this particular thing that was given to me. About that separation during the tribulation period to another place where you're elevated and protected and the people down below scorch, I've compared it to the book Alternative 3, or thought maybe there was some idea there in building space colonies to take the selected few to live up in the space colonies while the others were done away with genocide down below. And I got out one of my books published by Stanford University and the government. It's called Ames Research Center, the American Society for Engineering, NASA, the government, published a book in 1975 on program of space settlements. And the gist of the book is about these space colonies planned by Gerard O'Neill in Princeton, and some of the references in there. I'm going to give you about 5 references or 6 that are in the book. This is, again, about populating the space colonies as ideal location for some people. They use the references of Gerard O'Neill, of course, the book, The Colonization of Space Physics Today. He's done a lot of work on that, Space Colonies and Energy to Supply the Earth. Another book by Glaser, Power from the Sun. But there's a book by Mr. Goddard, who is head of the whole space agency, The Ultimate Migration, a manuscript called The Ultimate Migration. And then there's one by Bernal, a bibliography, The World, the Flesh, and the Devil. I'll have to get that book. It was published in London in 1929, The World, the Flesh, and the Devil. And then there's another on the Living Galaxy, and Mr. Wilcox, The Voyage That Lasted 600 Years. Those amazing years. There are 30 references here, one by Wernher von Braun, Crossing the Last Frontier. 30 references of books, but I thought those titles were interesting considering the kinds of separation they're talking about, that they can actually make the biblical separation come true. If you have 2 places to live, the earth and that place up there in the planets, and you're taken up there, you could say, well, God designed it for us to make, and so we'll use it, and those who want to survive can do so while the people down below are given something to be wiped out if they're non-believers. Now, one of the people on this board with Jerry Falwell and the Christian right that I'm talking about is Governor Clements from Texas on this Coalition for Peace Through Strength, the governor of Texas, the former governor of Texas. Now, there was an article just this last week on Mr. Bill Clements. He's the chairman of SEDCO board, and I want to share it with you because it came from the Houston Post. It was sent to me by a subscriber from Houston, and this is the story. SEDCO and Schlumberger to merge. Schlumberger is spelled Schlumberger. And these are 2 large companies that are going to merge now. Now, Bill Clements, as I say, is the former governor of Texas. Schlumberger was the organization used during the anti-Castro period where they were trying to overthrow Castro for the CIA in the Bay of Pigs. And people that worked for Schlumberger were such as Guy Bannister, who shared an office with Lee Harvey Oswald in New Orleans, and the anti-Castro Cubans, and they were sending weapons there to overthrow Fidel Castro. Frank Sturgis and E. Howard Hunt and Edwin Wilson and Theodore Shackley and Allen Dulles and Richard Nixon all worked with these organizations, and they in turn worked Oswald and Bannister with Clay Shaw, and Permandex, that goes back to Rome and Canada, and the international assassination teams. This is the article. SEDCO Incorporated, the Dallas-based offshore drilling company that former Texas Governor Bill Clements founded and still heads as chairman, agreed to a $1 billion merger with Schlumberger. Schlumberger family have had 70% of the all offshore oil industry drilling up to the present time. Maybe it slipped to 50 or 60 a few months ago, but about 70%. And Schlumberger is based in Paris. It's a high-technology oil field services company founded by a French engineer in 1926. It controls 70% of the oil field services industry. And the Clements family will merge with them. There are two companies, SEDCO and Schlumberger. So this international company formed in France that was used in Houston, Texas, and New Orleans and Miami for the Central Intelligence Agency for the job of getting rid of Fidel Castro and for infiltrating the islands in Central America or wherever they wanted to. This company is now merging with a large company owned and very much in control of the Clements family. As a matter of fact, it says the Clements family controls their stock to the extent of having 5 million of their own shares, and the Schlumbergers will have drilling operations. They have them all over the world, and they own a fleet of 55 land rigs, primarily located outside of North America, and Mr. Clements and Schlumbergers will make this nice bondage together. Analysts say the takeover is a surprise and could spawn other offers for SEDCO, which is Clements, or additional takeovers. The important thing is that a man such as Mr. Clements, who works with those people that I've described, the Jerry Falwell, Paul LAXALT, the far-right group that are linked to Jerry Falwell and the fundamentalist Christians, a combination with the Philip Schlaflys, the Helen Marie Taylors, the Albert Wiedemeyers, all working together. Now two huge giants out of the past, out of Houston, and out of the Kennedy-era assassination teams, international, are going to merge, and then goodness knows where they go from there. But those are just examples of histories of some of the people on this particular board with Jerry Falwell not separated from him. Now, many of you might have seen the CBS 60 Minutes last night, on Sunday night, September 30th. They had a program on the ACE in Texas. That's a group that starts Christian fundamentalist churches, and they have many members, and the pastors write to them. And if they take a one-week training course, this group supplies them with desks, flags, textbooks, artwork, what the students are supposed to read. They go for 1 week training, and they open up their private fundamentalist Christian schools. There's more than 1,000 schools that they've started already, and all the minister has to do is get in touch with an organization in Texas and go there for 1 week to be given all the training, such as the children will get when they go into their classes, the syllabus and the text for all the teaching of Christian children, I guess from kindergarten up through high school, comes in packages supplied in Texas and shipped all over the United States so that the fundamentalist Christians can start their own school. Now that you know the biblical beliefs of Jerry Falwell and his tribulation, pre-tribulation, millennium, and so forth, and how so many don't believe are going to roast in hell, I go from that mention of the broadcast on CBS to Jerry Falwell's newspaper. You can send for it. I don't have to read the whole thing to you, but if you don't have it or don't want it, I'll just share with you. This is September 1984, Jerry Falwell's Ministries Update, the 1984, the Year of Destiny. I take his newspaper, and this is what he writes. There is a hope for America, and the only hope is spiritual. We desperately need a genuine revival. We have to pray for revival. We preach revival, repent our sins. We have groups at home that are dangerous, like the feminists, the homosexuals, the ACLU, the Planned Parenthood. So I have a master plan for revival that has already begun, and I'm sure this group in Texas, you see, the ACE fits right into it. Number one, we must plant 5,000 new Bible-believing churches in North America. right away. The local church is God's agency for world evangelicism. We plant 5,000 new ones, and they will reactivate or be reactivated by other churches by AD 2000. We have already established 700 such churches, and AEC said that they have established 1,000 already, that they've set up 1,000. We have already 700 churches. They're pastored by Liberty Baptist College graduates. See, he's been having a school going since 1956. And now these are graduating, and they each get their own church, and the money is set up, the desks and flags. Each one is become a world missionary headquarter and evangelical outreach to its own community. Millions will be won to Christ. Each church must become an incubator to produce dynamic and dedicated young people to serve Christ worldwide. 2, once we start 5,000 new Christian day schools, there are already 30,000 Christian schools underway in America. 30,000. They're training millions of boys and girls. We need at least 5,000 more schools besides Bible-believing churches where we will train these millions, and we will have teachers dedicated, born-again Christians, and they will have academic excellence. Christian principles go hand in hand. Our Christian colleges will train thousands of school teachers and hundreds of administrators to meet the demand. That is what it means to our country. 10 to 15 million children will soon be in Christian schools. 3, we must build Liberty University to an enrollment of 50,000. He has this university where the teachers and people are coming out. By the next century, we will attract and train Christians so that we will become the Harvard of Christian schools. We're not just going to train preachers. We're going to have doctors, lawyers, engineers, scientists, educators, journalists, politicians, business people. They will be leaders for every sector of our society. Imagine competing for jobs if they flood the market with credentials from these schools and threaten them or have political people on campuses and so forth to get them located. You know what you'll be hearing. He says we must never lower our spiritual or academic standards in training the champions of Christ. If we want to change America, save America, and evangelize the world, we can't accommodate secular philosophy. That is diametrically opposed to Christian truth. Liberty is not for every student. Our graduates are different. They must be committed to change the world with the message of the crucified and the risen Christ. 4, we have to establish 1,000 Save a Baby centers nationwide. We have the program in Lynchburg. We've prevented 2,500 abortions in 2 years. 375 pastors asked for our assistance to help them establish that program in their church. 1,000 centers could help prevent 500,000 abortions annually, 1,000 centers. 5, we must continue to push the media and preach the gospel into every home. We've been preaching the gospel on radio and television to millions for 28 years, since 1956. That's the year that Reinhard Galen retired from the BND, the Galen operation, I believe, and then began going into his fundamental religious work. Or maybe it was in the 60s. I'll have to look that up. But the time sequence, I think, is important to this, because all of a sudden money poured from agencies to start these fundamentalist churches 28 years ago. We must not be content with the past. We need to increase our daily radio network and weekly television. We have to go into prime time where the greatest audience is. We must adopt every advancement in technology, satellite, video cassettes, reach every person, every means available. 6, we must publish the gospel message on printed page, every kind of publishing media, textbooks, gospel tracts, Christian literature, magazines, newspapers. We must increase the circulation of the Fundamentalist Journal and the Moral Majority Report, which reaches 1 million already. And 7, we must mobilize 25 million Americans to become activists for traditional and moral values in America. The secular humanists and the liberals have dominated the political scene. They have expelled God from their schools. They have legalized abortion. They have promoted pornography. They have brought their general moral breakdown of society. We have registered 5 million inactive voters in 5 years. We will keep the pace indefinitely. We have to not pull out any stops. We must train 25 million Americans to become informed and pro-moral activists so that their voices will be heard in Congress. That means out of 50 states, the voice of Gerald Falwell will be heard in Congress. So he isn't mincing words. It's like Mein Kampf. It's all there if you want to see it or not see it. Now, Martin Sheehan, who has an organization, People for the American Way, is trying to raise money and get help to fight people like Jerry Falwell. And recently on TV, they had a comment about Jerry Falwell, a quotation, and he said, we have 3 jobs now in terms of Christianizing America: save them and get them, baptize them, and register them to vote. You must commit yourself to God, and then you change your government. Now, that is an important point that he stresses all the time, on changing your government. There's a man who runs the Republican Party in Virginia, Chairman Don Huffman, Huffman. He said the liberal Democrats are falling away from God. This is in the Los Angeles Times, that they're not true Christian fundamentalists, and that you have to separate yourself from the liberal Democrats. Falwell lambasted the people running against him, Mr. Mondale, and he referred to Reagan and Vice President Bush as God's instrument for rebuilding America at the prayer breakfast. Many of you heard that and what he said. He also was proud of the fact that he could help influence the decision-making in the justices of the Supreme Court, the plank that said that the justices have to go along with the fundamentalist Christian idea of no abortions. Anyone who is pro-abortion cannot be appointed to a federal court. The Washington Times had the story, Falwell asked the plank on pro-life court. The Republican Party, under pressure from conservative religious leader, shaped its platform to commit President Reagan to appoint only abortion opponents to the Supreme Court. Falwell appeared before the Human Resources and Opportunities Subcommittee of the Party Platform Committee and urged that they restate their 1980 pledge to appoint only pro-life members to any federal judiciary. At the 1980 Republican Convention in Detroit, there was a battle over whether it was right for a president to commit himself on nominating a judge who holds a specific view on any issue, but Falwell warned the Republicans against taking for granted the vote of the religious fundamentalists unless they wrote this into their platform. When Falwell had a constitutional rally just recently, September the 15th, in Washington, D.C., he has a big brochure from the Moral Majority, Join America's Outstanding Christian Leaders. And up above is Ronald Reagan, the president, a picture of him, then Senator Bill Armstrong, then Pat Boone from Nugan Bank with the rail strips down there with Daniel Ludwig with narcotics flying out, Charles Colson from Watergate fame, who wanted to erase the Nixon tapes, Joyce Lansdorf and Alexander Solzhenitsyn, and Ephraim Zimbalist Jr. And they were having a party, and other people along with this, to celebrate their constitutional liberties rally, advertised Jerry Falwell with this team pushing the Constitution. Now, one of the things, there's several things he wants. One is a constitutional amendment that abortions are illegal across the board, the Constitutional Convention. And once you get the Constitutional Convention, Reagan's pushing that to get, in quotes, a balanced budget, blaming the Democrats for not having it. Then he can have all the military he wants and cut all the social benefits. And once they open the Constitutional Convention, for those two things, they will change the Constitution that a foreign-born can become president, and they'll open the door for Henry Kissinger. That's part and parcel of the Fritz Kramer support of the Falwell type and the fundamentalist Christian group. They're pushing for Kramer's mentor, Kissinger, to become president of the United States to represent these people. You saw Kissinger's face in and out of the White House this past week on television, on every interview, and Mr. Sonnenfeld and his cronies and Alexander Haig and Mr. Brzezinski. The country is run by Fritz Kramer, Henry Kissinger, Zbigniew Brzezinski. They are the people that meet the media up front, Mr. Richard Pipes, and behind the scenes is Fritz Kramer and Daniel Graham and Jerry Falwell and the fundamentalist Christians who make this president become president, and then he can make the policies that they want, including the Star Wars and the no abortions. There's something in there for everyone who's pushing it, and they're certainly pushing it hard. Now, next week, I'm going to do more on the fundamentalist Christians because they're very much in the news, and I'm not aware that we have really shared enough about them. We've talked about the Vatican and the Mormons and the Zionists. So I want to go into the Falwells and the Pat Robertsons. But our time is up now. This is Mae Brussell, and I'll be back with you next week.